I'll double that. Ed, was there anything else you wanted to address while you're on the floor?
Yeah, just briefly, thank you for bringing up the billing. I wanted to get that out, just because the transaction happened didn't mean that our responsibilities as a commission are over, and also our responsibilities on the CR, not on the conservation restriction. I want to briefly touch on what's happening with the conservation restriction. The town attorneys are going to handle that. That's through Koppelman and Page, Sharon Everett, a Boston firm, going to work with us on the conservation restriction. The responsibility the local commission still has, Foleyfield Lake Wallace, was to find an entity besides the town to hold the conservation restriction. So there's two parts here. One is to form the conservation restriction and make sure that everyone's interests are covered. EDIC's interest of what's going to go in there. So we have two steps. The first step is to make sure when we put this conservation restriction that you guys have a chance to review it and say, okay, this is exactly what we thought was going to happen with conservation restriction. So that's the first part. The second part is to give it to Boston, and then Boston has to okay this conservation restriction. And one of the responsibilities in order to have a conservation restriction is that you have to have a town entity owns the property, so they'll be part of the conservation restriction. But then you have to have a private group, a group that has, let's say a similar charter for conservation, and in this case maybe a little bit of recreation also, active recreation. So you have to look for an entity that has similar charter. My thoughts were, when I started the process, and I think a little bit of lawsuit translation, I should have probably started here first, but I couldn't make it last meeting, was to find an entity, a permanent entity that kind of fit what we're trying to do here in a conservation restriction, and a thought came up was the Belchertown Land Trust. They're a permanent, hopefully a permanent entity. Their responsibility in the charter is for conservation, and to see if they would want to hold the charter, to hold the conservation restriction along with the town of Belchertown. Okay, so there's two entities here. After it's drawn up and you guys have a chance to review it, Boston has a chance to come back and discuss this conservation restriction. So I guess I'm here to kind of inform you that that's what we're looking to do here, and see if you guys have any input on that process.
Seeing how I was involved in this early on, I think where you're going makes sense. That was when the conservation restriction covenant was discussed early on. I mean, that was one of Felicity's biggest concerns out of the box. I think she understood it better than we did at the time, and one of the things that she spent some time on and constantly asked questions about was who was going to hold the conservation restriction, and I don't think we ever really satisfied her questions on that, other than me saying, you know what, we're going to give them a certain amount of time to figure this out, and then she was fine with that because we were able to create some protections within the transfer to do just that. From what I heard from you, Ed, last time, was that this was moving along at a much faster pace than we had anticipated. I think we gave, through the end of the year?
It should be, assuming that everyone's kind of in agreement that, and obviously the Belchertown Land Trust has to say yes, that they want to take this. And again, it's really no liability on their part. They just have to,
somebody has to have the power.
Right. If something's going awry on this, someone has to have the power besides the owner of the property to say, hey, we have an issue on the conservation restriction here, and has to have the authority. So,
have they given any initial reaction?
No, I think it's my fault. I take complete blame. I think I went to Dan, but that he's a committee member here, and he's like, well, I'm kind of in conflict a little bit, and then it went to the president of I believe his name is James Fox. I think I lost the translation there, and I'm like, well, I better come to a meeting here and explain what we're doing. I first it was a inquisitive thing to Dan Baudet saying, hey, by the way, do you think the Belchertown Land Trust would be interested in holding this? And then it went on its own course too quickly, I think. And I should have. It was an informal thing, and then I was going to bring it here if they had any interest in it. So that's why I'm here today.
Come on, guys. Jim, do you have any sense? You still connected with them?
Pay my dues.
Never mind. Never mind.
No, I had to remove myself from, because of the appearance of the contract.
Be helpful to know when the process is gone. We really have to the end of the year on this stuff. The conservation restriction.
But you have longer, because I think in closing, they moved it all the way to, I believe, June 30th
Oh,
of next
okay.
year. I believe they moved it to just in case we had an issue of who was going to hold it. So it's not something we have to rush through.
Mhm, mhm.
But again, I don't want to leave necessarily anything open, just for the sake of leaving it open.
Question, is the conservation restriction, is that anything like the agricultural APRs, where there's money involved in converting the land if it's held by a private? No, conservation restrictions are purely,
It's a deed restriction
okay.
Yeah. And-
regarding the use of the land.
Right, and they were really, sorry for interrupting, they're really brought up in prominence now because of CPA funding. CPA purchases property, and more so, they get to, do rehab on fields, whereas if you don't use CPA money to purchase a field, you can't do anything. So these conservation restrictions, deed restrictions are not good enough because I think the town vote of 2/3 can wipe out the deed restriction. And these CRs are more permanent, so this conservation restriction is important. Speaking with the attorney in Boston for Massachusetts, Irene Delvano, somewhat concerned in the beginning was making sure it was going to be flexible enough for what we were all thinking. We don't want a building, maybe we want, maybe they put the swimming pool back into place, I doubt it, but certain things. And she says, oh no, these things were put in place for active recreation along with passive recreation too, not just passive. She goes, you probably see a whole bunch of copies of a whole bunch of passive things that get you nervous. She's like, no, these things were put together for active side. Just give us a copy of what you're doing. We'll amend and edit and cross out what the wording, and Complement page will do a nice job. They've gone through this process, so I'm sure Sharon Ever, I'm sure we never will do a nice job on that. But again, we want to bring it to you or in the draft form to make sure that it's in your understanding too of what was supposed to be done on this property.
Kirk, looks like you have something on your mind,
Well,
sir.
I'm just curious as to the nature of it, and what the problems would be if the EDIC were to own that, since we are going to be the body that is going to determine whether any amendments to that are made in the future. It certainly would simplify things. I mean, it could be a shared thing with land trust, but why, what would the legal ramifications be?
I'm not sure that your legal existence defines you in a way that allows you to have a conservation restriction. Not anybody in the world can have a conservation restriction and hold it. There's a nonprofit that has been designed for this or that or the other thing. There's a list of requirements that you need to fulfill in order to be allowed to hold the conservation restriction. I don't know the whole list in my head, but you may or may not be.
That's a good point, and I think just because of you are being appointed by town individuals,
Quasi-town
right?
government.
Then there's some sort of intertwining that they are
Well,
controlling it.
absolutely.